The Nuremberg War Crimes trials, undoubtedly the most famous war crimes tribunals of the 20th century and perhaps even of the past 500 years. And we've all heard of the major international military tribunal and maybe even have some information and some knowledge of this tribunal, which took place from the middle of August 1945. But there were a further 12 subsequent trials that brought together some of the lower echelons of the Nazi Party, the doctors, for instance, who were responsible for some of the most terrible medical experiments of the Second World War, the industrialists that were tasked with the responsibility of arms manufacture, the production of the guns and the tanks and the ships and the planes, etc. The bankers, who were held responsible for the financing of the armament production and manufacture, and the 4 Einsatzgruppen death squads. These squads were members of the SS, and they were responsible for more than 1 million murders, mass murderers they were, in Poland from the middle of September 1939, right the way through to Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia in 1941. They killed, as I say, more than 1 million Russians and Poles, mainly Jews, and they were brought to book in a special trial, a subsequent trial after the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg. Now, I'm not a scholar, I'm not a student, I'm certainly not an expert of this subject, but I do have a fascination, and that's what I'd like to talk to you about during the next few minutes. At the end of the Second World War in April 1945, there were still about 10 million Nazis, 10 million Germans that were registered as members of the Nazi Party. Of these, tens of thousands were responsible for the mass murder of the Jews in the concentration camps in the East. But these were not the people that were brought to book at Nuremberg. These people were tried primarily in Poland and Russia, where the concentration camps were, because they were responsible for the guarding of the camp. They were the camp guards, they were the people that put the Zyklon B canisters, gas canisters, into the gas pipes at Treblinka, at Sobibor and at Birkenau. The International Military Tribunal tried 24 leaders of the Nazi Party, including Martin Bormann. Now, Martin Bormann was Hitler's secretary, but he was not at Nuremberg. We think he was killed during an attempted escape at the end of April 1945. It's circumstantial, though, because the body of Martin Bormann was never recovered. Hermann Goering, the Reich Marshal of the Nazi Party, the head of the Luftwaffe, and probably number 2 to Hitler, was certainly at Nuremberg, as was Wilhelm Keitel, who was the head of the armed forces, a general. Albert Speer, he was responsible for the production of the armaments and also responsible for the recruitment of much of the enforced labour that Germany employed during the Second World War. He was also Hitler's architect. Julius Streicher, he was a nasty piece of work. He was a real anti-Semite, the editor of a magazine called Der Stürmer, an anti-Semitic magazine that was first published, I believe, at the beginning of 1936 and continued publication until the early part of the Second World War. Hans Frank. Hans Frank was the head of the general government that was not part of the Third Reich in Poland. And he was responsible for the transport of the millions of Jews from Warsaw into primarily into Auschwitz-Birkenau. Now, of the 24 defendants at the International Military Tribunal, they were served with 74 indictments. And there were 4 counts of the indictments. There was conspiracy, there was crimes against peace, there was war crimes, and finally crimes against humanity. The soldier that served these indictments was Major Airey Neve, who was one of the few successful escapees at Colditz, or from Colditz. Airey Neve was unfortunately murdered in, I believe, 1974, in a car bombing in Parliament, the British Parliament, by the IRA. Now the verdicts, there were no jury at Nuremberg. There were just 4 judges that decided who was guilty and who was not guilty. These judges, one from each of the Allied countries, Great Britain, United States of America, France and Russia. Of the 22 now, because Robert Ley, who was also brought to Nuremberg for trial, he committed suicide before the indictment could be served by airing Eve on him. So there were 22 defendants at Nuremberg. 12 of them were hung. 3 had life sentences. 4 were sentences between 10 and 20 years, and there were 3 acquittals. Now these life sentences were not life sentences in reality, because by 1954, with the beginning of the Cold War, I think all of the defendants that were given life sentences were released. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is just a small interpretation of the events that took place during the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunals. I hope it's given you a little bit of an insight of what took place. Thank you very much indeed.